So I want you to tell us about when you were getting ready to leave West Virginia and move to upstate New York, and where your life went once you, I believe you were 9 years old and you
Right.
were in upstate New York.
Well, it was winter time. We had moved out of the house in Beckley and into Bubby Gussie and Pop's house, and as we were scheduled to leave, but unfortunately I got scarlatina, which is like scarlet fever, but a milder case, and we had to postpone it. But then after about a week and a half, we were able to leave, my mother, Avery, and I, because my father was already in Albany, New York. And we took the train from Prince Station outside of Beckley to New York City. I think, I don't know if it was Grand Central or Pennsylvania Station. It was very exciting. When we got there, I was terrified by the escalators. I thought they would swallow me up. And Dad met us at the train, and we got into a car and proceeded to drive from New York City to Albany. And it was winter time, and I'm telling you, I had never seen anything more gorgeous. As we drove along the New York State Turnpike, because the trees were covered with ice and snow was all around us. And we got to the house, the flat on Summit Street in Albany, which was in the old Jewish neighborhood. And I remember my first meal in Albany was delicatessen, corned beef sandwiches, corned beef and pickles and all kinds of fantastic stuff that I hardly ever had, but fell in love with. The house on Summit Ave was a duplex. We lived in the upper flat. The people that lived below us were the Hurd family. And I remember they had 3 sons. The mother's name was Yetta. Can't remember the father's name. I don't remember the older son's name, but I do remember Richard, the middle son, who was 2 years older than I, and Joey, the youngest. And we were a block away from the old Orthodox synagogue, a tiny little place. Right next to it was a huge hill. That was the Federal Street Shul. And behind our house was a big, big meadow that led to Delaware Avenue. And on Delaware Avenue was a yeshiva. And then a block and a half away across Delaware Avenue was the school that Auntie Avery and I would go to, PS 18, public school number 18. Anyway, we lived in Albany all those years. I had a difficult time initially. I was a chubby kid. I had frizzly red hair, lots of freckles, and the beginning of pimples, believe it or not. And it was hard. I was in 4th grade, and that was not an easy year. The next year, I had a wonderful 5th grade teacher who invited the students to her class. And my mother, who was concerned that I wouldn't have friends, had a party, invited all the girls from the class for a barbecue. That I remembered. And I remember all the boys that were in the class came outside and were really upset that they couldn't be part of the party. So funny that stuck in my mind. Anyway, we lived on Summit Avenue. I went to Hebrew school at this brand new synagogue, Temple Israel, conservative synagogue, and absolutely loved it. I lapped it up and went every Sunday, Monday, and Wednesday the first few years, and then on Sunday, Tuesday, and Thursday. Anyway, that first summer, I met my dearest friend of childhood, Elaine Talakansky. And while our parents were playing cards, Elaine and I were upstairs, and we were playing jacks, and I cheated like crazy. And, you know, we had the most wonderful relationship. All the years until she died many, many, many years later, and I saw her shortly before her death. Anyway, I finished school at PS 18, 6th grade. I had two very dear friends, one who lived next door to us in Albany, and another who lived, is it Albany? On Summit Ave? Yeah, lived next door to us, Linda K. Smith, and across the street, Margaret Spano, who was 2 years older. Linda Kay was a year older than I. And we played street games in the summer in the middle of the street. It was wonderful. You know, that's how we spent our childhood. Either playing street games in the summertime or sledding down the Federal Street Hill next to the synagogue, the most magical hill in the world. I thought at that time. It was really very, very exciting. So I went to junior high. Can't remember the name of the junior high. Hackett Junior High. Hackett Junior High. And for 7th, 8th, and 9th grade. And I was learning how to play the violin. My father was my teacher. Big mistake, because every time I'd make a mistake, my father would take the violin and correct me and then get carried away playing every concerto under the sun. Auntie Avery was dancing, taking dancing lessons. I decided I wanted to learn how to play guitar. And when we finished 9th grade, my father took a position as manager of Union Fern Furniture Company in Utica, New York. My mother really wanted to be closer to her two sisters, one who lived in Utica, that was Aunt Roz Savlov, and the other was Aunt Bubbles, who lived in Syracuse, New York. Aunt Roz had 3 daughters, Marion, the oldest, Harriet, the middle one, who was 2 years older than I, and Jerry, who was just 2.5 months younger than I. So we moved to Utica, and because of the incredible, incredible experience that I had in Hebrew school in Albany, New York, the principal was one of the most exciting educators, I could call him an educator now, that I had ever met. I had a fabulous background, so that when I went to Utica, I was a big shot. I knew more than anybody in the Hebrew school at that time. And I became very involved in United Synagogue Youth, which was the conservative youth movement. And the advisor, Mrs. Resnikoff, Bert Resnikoff, took such a liking to me that I became her protege. And she was not only the advisor for United Synagogue Youth in Utica, but she was also very important on a New York State regional level. So I had the most wonderful time in USY. I had some good friends. I joined a high school sorority that met at the JCC, which was a house on Genesee Street in Utica. There were 2 Jewish fraternities and 2 Jewish sororities. And I went to proms, and I you know, I had a fairly good time. I was a really good student. I was in important classes at the time, but USY was my major love, and I actually won a scholarship that was offered by the Abelov family in memory of Mr. Abelov's wife. There were 3 scholarships offered, a full one to spend a summer in Israel and 2 half scholarships, and I won the full scholarship. And that summer that I graduated from high school, I went to Israel. That was 1963. I had a very good and competitive friend in high school. Actually, 2 very good friends, but the first one I'll talk about is Leon Perlman, who was president of our U.S.-wide chapter, and we were always competitive. And whenever we would lead Friday night services at the synagogue, Temple Bethel, we had to fight over who was going to lead which prayers. It was very, very silly. The offshoot is he went on, after many years, became a chazan, and now lives in Sweden as cantor emeritus in Gothenburg. Tamar once bought a recording and saw Leon Perlman on it, and she said, "Is that your friend from high school?" And I said, "Yes," and I called him. Tried to connect with him. It never worked. Finally, when there was anti-Semitism rearing its ugly head, and I had just moved to Israel, I let him know that I lived in Zichron Yaakov, and he said that his wife has family in Israel, and they sometimes go to Israel to visit. And I said, well, definitely let me know, and we'll hook up. The other high school friend that I had was Bobby, can't remember his name, but his uncle was Kirk Douglas. And I remember going to Bobby's bar mitzvah and shaking Kirk Douglas's hand and saying, "I'm never going to wash my hands." I just met this very famous man. Anyway, life in Utica was good. My Aunt Roz, we would spend time with my Aunt Roz. I was not that close with my cousins during my childhood. I'm not sure why. I mean, my parents didn't encourage. Well, and the other thing is my cousins, the 2 older ones, were out of the house. I was bridesmaid at their weddings, at both of their weddings, and there's a picture here of me at that wedding, at one of the weddings. And it was during my high school years. My mother had plastic surgery. She had developed cancer of the thyroid when I was just a toddler, and went to New York for radioactive therapy, which burned her neck terribly. So during my high school years, she had plastic surgery to repair the damage on her neck, and she was always in fragile health, and so consequently I spent a lot of time being sidekick with my father. Whenever he'd go on errands, I was the one that always enjoyed going with him, whereas Auntie Avery, more often than not, had other more important things to do. And my mother always wanted me to get my bachelor's degree in nursing. I wanted to be a doctor and to be a surgeon, actually, because I was always very, very good with my hands. And I applied to nursing, hospital nursing school programs, because I thought, well, I could always go to college. And I went to Boston and checked out Beth Israel Hospital, and absolutely fell in love with Boston and being at Beth Israel. It was very exciting. I also went down to Alfred University in the lower southwestern part of New York State, near Binghamton, New York, because they had a bachelor's program and I had won a Regent scholarship to go. But after going to Boston, I thought, that's where I've got to be. So that's where I went. Um, Graduated high school, summer of 1963. I saw all these kids. I had no idea they were in my high school graduating class. Um, lot of fun events during those high school years in Utica. A lot of sorority and fraternity proms. I had a friend, Jerry Landesman, that I went to proms with. I had a boyfriend, can't remember his name. He was 2 years older than I, and he went to McGill. Oh, God. And then, but the critical thing is I didn't go to my high school prom because I really wanted to go with Bobby Citron. And my high school, but the guy that invited me to his high school prom 2 years before, his name was David, but I can't remember the name, insisted that I go with him. And I ended up not going with anybody, which is why many years later I had a prom at the crowd in school to make up for it in my 63rd in honor of graduating in 1963. I loved Boston from the time I got there. I loved Beth Israel. Very shortly after I got to the BI, as we called it, by the way, I'd always started playing guitar and learning Hebrew songs and Jewish songs, and my grandfather taught me some Yiddish, and I took guitar lessons in high school in Utica, and so would always bring a guitar when I went on weekends with USY. We called them kinusim, conventions. Sometimes it was home hospitality, sometimes it was at a hotel. And during those years, by the way, during those years in USY, I was very, very active on a regional level, and actually was slated to become president of the New York State region of United Synagogue Youth, the Tzafon region, but my parents didn't want me to do that because they felt it was my senior year. They felt that I had really, it was important to not be stressed out, and there would be so much involved, and there probably would have been a financial obligation to travel a lot, and my parents were not well off. There was so often a bit of a struggle with finances, and I opted to run as vice president of the region, which I did, and I won. And I was also what was called Ruach chairman, where I would lead singing and dancing and for the entire convention, and it was just so much fun, so much fun. One weekend that I did want to go to, a very poignant story. I wanted to go to this weekend, and I knew it would be a financial hardship for my parents. I mean, it was an indulgence on their part to let me travel the way I did. And somehow I realized, when they said, you know, we're sorry, Esther Lee, you just can't do it this time. And I remember saying, I totally understand, it's okay, and put it out of my mind. And they came back to me maybe later in the day or the next day, and they said, and one of my folks said, my mother, I think, said, your father and I decided that you should go. And I thought, you know, and that really touched a chord. I'm so glad that I didn't make a big deal and be a selfish little bitch and say, but I want to go, but that I understood and just accepted what they said. Well, anyway, I got to Boston, as I said, and maybe shortly after, maybe a month or two, well, I got my ears pierced the first week I was there by an upperclassman that uses a surgical needle with thread attached. And it was great. I think 3 of us had the upperclassmen do it. It was kind of like our initiation. And one of them had a birthday party, a senior. She had a boyfriend, and she was actually engaged. Almost unheard of that anybody should be serious while we were in nursing school. And her husband had invited this young man from South Boston who was a musician to come and make music. And so we started at the party, we started to sing together. And he asked if he could come the next day. And I said, sure. It was actually, I remember his coming to the nurse's residence, and there was a Christmas tree. So obviously it had to have been December. And we sang a lot of the old folk songs, Peter, Paul, and Mary, and Joan Baez, and, you know, the music of the later 60s at that time. And, excuse me, we decided we would form a trio, and he had a friend that played guitar as well. So the three of us were like this this trio, and we performed in a coffee house, the Jolly Roger Cafe at Harvard Square. And we actually performed at a folk festival somewhere on the North Shore. I can't remember exactly where it was, but it was a big folk festival. And yeah, the musician, the friend that I met, his name was Bobby Seale from South Boston. And anyway, I was elected president of my class, my freshman class, and elected president of my sophomore class. And I remember we had a lot of talent shows in the nurses' residence. Actually, we did them in the hospital auditorium, which was really very exciting because a lot of the nurses and a lot of the house staff would come to these events. And I had a great time. I just had a great time in Boston. That was the first time as a freshman that I ever tasted alcohol. I remember going to a party on Beacon Hill and with a couple of my classmates, and it was on the third floor of a triplex on Beacon Hill, and they were college students all there, and I remember having 3 teacups filled with Seagram 7 and 7-Up and sliding down the banister when it was time to go. Then we got back to the nurse's residence 10 minutes before the 1 o'clock curfew that I had. And I asked the house mother if I could go across the parking lot into the hospital to get some ice cream from the slot machine. And she said yes. And I remember getting an ice cream sandwich, coming back and taking off the paper in her office and licking all the way around it, and then said to her, "Mrs. Madore, would you like a bite?" After I had licked the whole thing. Anyway, she was very understanding. The next day I had what I realized was a hangover. I thought I was going to die. Anyway, during the beginning of my senior year, my mother was re-diagnosed with cancer. And it was probably the result of, it could have been a slow-growing metastases, but it was cancer of the larynx. She had had the thyroid removed and had massive x-ray therapy, and I have a feeling that after 20 years, that massive x-ray therapy caused the cancer of the larynx. And she was going back to New York Hospital, which is part of Cornell, Columbia Presbyterian Medical Center. Very famous hospital, Sloan Kettering, for cancer research, because her doctor was there. And ultimately, she had a laryngectomy. And I remember the night before she had the laryngectomy, before she went into the hospital for the surgery, it was Pesach, and we had a Seder at my mother's aunt's house, my Aunt Alma and Uncle Al Golden. Aunt Alma had 2 children. The oldest was a daughter, and the younger one was a son who had spent time in the Peace Corps in India. And I had a crush on him, and a real crush on him in my high school and college years. Sasha was his nickname. My mother had the surgery. I commuted twice from Beth Israel in Boston because I was still a student, and took the train from Boston to New York. And then my mother, when she had the surgery, and I remember the last time that I had seen her, she was bandaged, her head and her neck. I understand that there was so much damage to the blood vessels that they had to replace pints and pints and pints of blood. For some reason, 50 pints of blood rings a bell, and I can't imagine that. I mean, at any rate, Auntie Avery was able to see her in the recovery room, in the surgery. She had 2 operations, I guess. She had the laryngectomy, and then they had to open her chest a week later. And I was in Boston. I didn't see her. So the last memory that I have of her was bandaged up and waving to her. I was with my Aunt Selma, my mother's father's sister. My mother was Aunt Selma's favorite niece of the 3 nieces. And I remember my Aunt Selma gave me her massive charm bracelet. She said, "This is meant for your mother, but I want you to wear it now because your mother can't wear it." And then after my mother passed away, my Aunt Selma asked if she could have it back, and I said, of course. It was not something that a 19-and-a-half-year-old would wear. Anyway, we sat Shiva in Utica, New York, and that's where my mother is buried, next to her mother and her father, who are buried in Utica. And we stayed with my Aunt Roz. I remember during the time that we stayed there, I met my friend Leon, who was working at Howard Johnson, and we walked into the fields behind where we used to live in Utica. I didn't mention that while I was in nursing school, my father and mother moved to Cleveland, Ohio, actually to Pepper Pike, which is a suburb outside of Cleveland, which was very, very rural in those days. Now, it's just an overgrown suburb. The family insisted that I transfer to nursing school in Cleveland. I didn't have much say in the matter, so I did. And finally finished nursing school, much to, I really hated being in Cleveland. Early on I thought, this is awful. But I was singing. I would, on my weekends off, I would go spend the weekend with my father and Auntie Avery in the apartment where they were living in Pepper Pike, and would sing in a couple of coffee houses in Cleveland. um, one day there was a message for me in the nurse's residence that somebody got my name. His name was Frank Porath, and he wondered if he could meet me. And it turns out his mother had heard me sing at either a Hadassah event or an Ort event in Cleveland. Or a Pioneer Women. She was a big macher in the Jewish community. And so I met Frank, and during my senior year, we started dating, and we introduced our parents at Passover at a Seder. And in October, on Sweetest Day, my father gives Auntie Avery and me each a card and then tells us he and Sarah Porath were going to get married.